Have you ever felt your heart stop for a full second? Like the world around you froze, the air vanished from your lungs, and everything just stopped? That's exactly what happened the moment I heard these words. Ma'am, you're pregnant. My name is Margaret Louise Parker. I'm 77 years old now. I've been through a lot in this life. But nothing like this. And I'm going to tell you the whole story. It was an ordinary autumn morning. I remember the smell of the coffee brewing in the old cloth filter, the steam rising through the cracked window above the sink, and that sharp, chilly wind sneaking in from outside, carrying the scent of burning wood and dry leaves. I lived alone at the time, in a little faded blue wooden house on the edge of a quiet village near Fairbanks, Alaska. It's a place of extremes, too cold in the winter, too quiet in the loneliness. The old wooden floors creaked under my slippers as I shuffled to the porch with a steaming mug in my hands. My bones don't move like they used to. Every step feels like a reminder that time slips by faster than we expect. But that day, something felt off. Something inside me wasn't right. A weird nausea, dizzy spells that wouldn't stop, lingering for days. I figured it was my blood pressure acting up again. Or maybe my heart. I've had a few scares in the past. So I called Dr. Matthew Collins, the town's family doctor. He's known me for over 25 years, ever since I first moved to Fairbanks, to get away from the noise and start over. He told me to come in the next morning. I remember the way his old space heater rattled while I sat in the waiting room with my hands trembling in my lap. When he finally came in with the test results, his face looked confused, not worried, just searching for the right words. I thought it was bad news. Something serious. Cancer, maybe. But nothing could have prepared me for what came out of his mouth. Margaret, he said slowly, this is going to sound impossible, but your tests show that you're pregnant. For a full second, I thought I misheard him. The word just floated there. Pregnant? At 62? Was this some kind of mistake? A joke? A lab error? I laughed. I actually laughed. A sharp, nervous, panicked laugh that bubbled out before I could stop it. But he didn't laugh. He just stood there, watching me, eyes calm but firm. This can't be right, I whispered. Doctor, I'm too old. It's not even medically possible. He sat down gently and said, I know it sounds insane, but the ultrasound shows a small gestational sac. It's early, but it's there. I stood up so fast my head spun. Everything blurred. For a moment, I thought I might faint. I gripped the edge of the chair, heart pounding in my chest, face hot, palms cold. I sat back down in shock. I'm 62 years old, doctor. It's rare, he said, almost unheard of, but it has happened in some medical journals. Possibly a late ovulation, a dormant egg, maybe even triggered by hormonal fluctuations. I've never seen it myself, but it's not entirely out of the realm of science. My brain couldn't process it. I just sat there, frozen. Emotions I hadn't felt in years started creeping up my spine. Fear, shame, confusion. A lump swelled in my throat. My fingers curled into fists without me realizing it. And then came the worst part. The silence. Because I had no one to call, no one to tell. I lived alone. My grown kids had drifted away. Christmas cards, short phone calls, polite distance. My ex-husband died 5 years ago. The few friends I had in town had their own lives. There was no one. On the drive back home, the sky looked grayer than usual. Every pine tree I passed seemed like it was staring at me, as if the whole world had just found out my secret. When I walked into my little kitchen, I leaned back against the door, slid down to the floor, and sobbed. I mean sobbed. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep, somewhere raw. I felt like a terrified girl again. Lost. Alone. Barely. Breathing. How could this be happening to me? Me, Margaret Louise Parker, 62 years old, pregnant, and in that moment, I didn't know whether to laugh, scream, or disappear. If this grandma's story is touching your heart, leave a like. It helps the channel a lot and shows that you want to hear more real stories like this one. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories. And if you know someone who needs to hear something like this, share it. Sometimes, a simple story can change an entire day. Thank you for being here and listening with your heart. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the old rocking chair near the fireplace with a blanket over my shoulders, staring at the flickering light like it might offer some answers. The wind outside had picked up and was howling against the windows. My tea had gone cold hours before. I was too afraid to go to bed, afraid of waking up and realizing this wasn't just a strange dream. At some point, the realization settled in me like heavy snow on a rooftop. This was real. There was life inside me, at 62. I kept replaying everything I'd read or heard over the years. Women hit menopause, hormones drop, the body moves on. Babies were a chapter closed long, long ago. I had raised 3 kids. Darren, Michael, and Katie, grown adults now, each living in different states. Darren in Texas, busy with his 3rd divorce. Michael up in Oregon, barely speaking to me since the family split. And Katie. Well, Katie was the only one who still sent postcards. I hadn't held a baby in my arms in over a decade. And yet, here I was, pregnant. I thought of calling someone. But who? My best friend Helen had died 2 winters ago. My cousin Lillian was battling dementia. I had neighbors, sure, nice enough people. But who do you call at 3 a.m. and say, I think I'm having a baby at 62, without sounding like you've lost your mind? The next morning, I walked into the tiny general store in town, one of those cozy, dusty places that smells like sawdust and cinnamon. I needed eggs and tissues. My face was puffy from crying. As I grabbed a carton of milk from the fridge, I heard a familiar voice. Morning, Maggie. Cold one, huh? It was James, the retired postman, a kind man in his early 70s who always wore the same flannel shirts. He smiled at me like nothing in the world was strange. I smiled back, nodded and said, Sure is. And inside, I was screaming. No one knew what was going on inside me. Later that day, Dr. Collins called, with the full lab results. He sounded more settled now, like he had read enough to understand what was happening. He said the pregnancy seemed viable, but that it would be extremely high risk. He wanted me to come in weekly for monitoring. I agreed, even though part of me wanted to disappear into the woods and pretend none of this was happening. That afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, studying myself. My hair had long since gone white, and my skin was marked with the maps of time. I touched my stomach and didn't feel anything. No movement, no bump. Just silence. That's when it hit me like a punch to the chest. I was terrified. Not of death, no. I'd made peace with that long ago. I was terrified of being needed again. Of starting over. Of loving something so deeply and losing it. At my age, you know loss better than joy. You've buried your parents, maybe a husband. Some bury children. Friends vanish. Time becomes your shadow. I had finally reached a place of quiet. solitude, peace even. And suddenly, this spark of life, this little flicker of impossible light, was tearing through the walls I'd built. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I prayed. Not a fancy prayer. Not a church kind of prayer. Just a whisper, in the dark. God, I don't know what you're doing, but please help me. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. Tears slid down my cheeks, hot and slow. I laid on the couch, curled like a child, holding a pillow to my chest, like it might keep me from falling apart. That was the night I felt it. The first twinge. Not pain, exactly. Just a shift. A ripple. And even though it could have been... In my head, I whispered something I never imagined I'd say again. Hi, baby. I didn't leave the house for 3 days. I just couldn't. Every time I thought about going outside, I panicked. What would people say if they found out? What if someone saw me at the clinic? What if this was all a mistake and I wasn't pregnant at all? Or worse, what if I was, and it ended before I had time to even make sense of it? I sat in my kitchen most of those days. Same chair, same window, just listening. The ticking of the wall clock, the slow hum of the fridge, the whispering wind pressing against the glass. I've lived through hurricanes and house fires. I've buried my father and held my husband's hand as he passed away in a hospital bed. But nothing, not a single event in my life, had unsteadied me like this had. On the 4th day, I got up before sunrise, boiled water for tea, and stared at the steam curling up like ghostly fingers. I reached for the old photo frame on the windowsill, the one with my 3 kids when they were little. Katie was maybe 5. Darren had that terrible bowl cut I gave him myself. Michael had just lost his front tooth. I felt something tear inside me. The truth is, I missed being a mom. Even with the pain, the exhaustion, the mess, there was a warmth in that chaos. Something alive. And even though my children had grown distant, I never stopped loving them with every brittle piece of me. I reached for the phone. My hand trembled. I dialed Katie's number in Arizona. My heart thudded against my ribs as it rang. She answered on the 3rd ring. Hi, Mom. Just hearing her voice, sweet, tired, familiar, almost made me hang up. I wasn't ready to say it out loud, but I tried. Katie, sweetheart, I need to tell you something, but I need you to breathe and promise not to laugh or scream. Pause. Okay? And I told her. I told her everything. The fainting spells, the tests, the ultrasound, Dr. Collins, my tears, my fear. I told her how I hadn't told anyone else because I didn't know how. For a long moment, there was just silence. Then, Mom, is this real? Yes, I said, voice cracking. I wish it wasn't. I don't even know how it happened. But I am. I'm pregnant. More silence. Then I heard her crying. But not the kind I expected. Mom, she whispered, this is crazy. But maybe it's also beautiful. Maybe it's a gift. I cried too. Not because I believed it yet, but because someone had heard me. Someone knew. I wasn't alone anymore. We talked for nearly an hour. She asked about the doctor, about the risks, about what I wanted to do. I didn't have many answers. She didn't push. She just stayed on the line, present, soft. When we finally hung up, I walked to the bathroom. I looked at myself again. My skin sagging beneath my chin, my eyes puffy, my silver hair tied in a loose bun. But behind all of that was a flicker. Not hope. Not yet. Just something. A small light. That evening, as the sun fell behind the snow-covered trees, I stepped outside. The air was cold enough to bite, but I didn't care. I wanted to feel the wind on my face, to prove I was still here, that this was real. I stood in the middle of the yard, under a sky blooming with stars. I wrapped both hands over my belly and whispered, "I don't know who you are yet. I don't know if you'll stay, but I know I feel you now. And if you're real, I will try. I will try with everything I've got left." Something in the sky shimmered then. Maybe a shooting star. Maybe just a trick of the light. But it felt like something heard me. It's strange how quickly your world can shrink to the size of your living room when something like this happens. Before all this, I used to go out every morning. I'd visit the little bakery run by the Peterson sisters. I'd pick up fresh rye bread and maybe a cinnamon roll if I was feeling rebellious. Sometimes I'd join the quilting circle at the community center, even if my fingers weren't what they used to be. Those days seemed so ordinary. And now, they felt like they belonged to someone else. Now, everything felt different. Every sound, every smell, every hour of the day was loaded with meaning. I started noticing the ticking of my wall clock more often. I could tell the time by how the light moved across the floorboards. My house, once just a quiet space to grow old in, suddenly became sacred. It was shelter. It was hiding. I didn't tell Darren or Michael yet. I wasn't ready. Katie had taken the news with such grace, but I couldn't count on the boys being that soft. Darren would laugh. He always had that edge. And Michael, well, he stopped trusting me after the divorce. I think a part of him still blames me for the way things fell apart. And then there was the town. Small-town Alaska is beautiful, but it's also nosy. One whispered word at the pharmacy, and by nightfall, everyone knows your business. I couldn't bear the thought of becoming that crazy old woman everyone gossiped about between church pews or over pie at the diner. Dr. Collins called to schedule my first full prenatal scan. I could hear the hesitation in his voice, like he was still trying to believe what the machines had already confirmed. "We're going to take it 1 week at a time, Margaret," he said. "There's a long road ahead, but you're strong, and we'll be cautious every step of the way." Strong. People love that word, but they don't always understand what it costs. Strength for me wasn't about courage. It was about showing up. For 3 days, I couldn't even step out my door. But on the morning of the appointment, I put on my warmest coat, wrapped my scarf tight, and stepped into the cold. As I drove the old pickup truck down the icy road, I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. Every bump in the road made me flinch. I was aware of my body in a way I hadn't been since my 20s. Protective, alert, terrified. At the clinic, the nurse led me to the ultrasound room. It was quiet, sterile, filled with that humming sound that only machines and nerves can make together. I laid back on the padded table, heart racing, breath shallow. The cold gel shocked my skin. I flinched. Then the screen flickered to life, and there it was, a tiny flicker, a heartbeat, not mine. The doctor adjusted the probe gently, and we both stared. "There it is," he whispered. "That's the heartbeat." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't cry. I could barely think. But in that moment, something inside me changed. I wasn't just terrified anymore. I was connected to that little flicker, to that life, to that absurd, impossible truth. It was real. They were real. I left the clinic that day in silence. No music on the radio, no calls, no thoughts I could put into words. Just a woman, in her 60s, driving through the snow-covered hills of Alaska, with a secret growing quietly inside her. That night, I pulled out the baby quilt I'd kept tucked away in an old chest for decades. I'd made it for my first grandchild, but somehow it had never been used. I ran my hands over the soft fabric, fingers tracing the tiny stars I had stitched long ago. I never thought I'd hold a baby again. Certainly not my own. I didn't think the loneliness could grow any larger. But it did. After the ultrasound, after hearing that heartbeat, I came home and sat on my porch swing. The wind had picked up. The kind of wind that slices right through your coat and finds your bones. I didn't feel it. Not really. My body was there, but my mind, it was floating, drifting. I was carrying life. Inside a body the world had already labeled as done. That word haunted me. Done. It's the word they use for women after a certain age. You're done raising kids. Done being needed. Done being desired. You're no longer seen. Not really. You become a background character in everyone else's story. But now, I had a story of my own again, and no one knew how to read it. That night, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I wrote in my journal. I pulled it from the bottom drawer of my nightstand, the same leather notebook I'd used when my husband passed away. The pages smelled like time. November 12th. Tonight I heard the heartbeat again, just in my head, like an echo. It wasn't loud, just steady. Quiet but sure. I wonder who you are, little one. I wonder why you came now, when I thought I had nothing left to give. Are you here to teach me something I forgot? Or to remind me of who I was, long before I grew old? I wrote until my hand cramped. The next morning, Katie called again. Her voice was lighter this time. How are you feeling today, Mom? Still shocked, still scared, but still here, I said. She laughed softly. I told her about the ultrasound, about the heartbeat. She grew quiet, then said something that stopped me cold. Do you think you'll keep the baby? I froze. I hadn't let myself even ask that question out loud. It had never even occurred to me to not. But the weight of it hit me then. What it would mean to carry this pregnancy to the end. The risk, the eyes, the judgment, the financial strain, the isolation. Could I really raise a child again? At 62? Would I even live long enough to see them graduate high school? Or worse? What if I didn't make it through the pregnancy? The statistics weren't in my favor. My heart, my age, my joints, my everything. I wasn't young. I wasn't strong the way I used to be. I couldn't afford to think this was some fairy tale. This was real and dangerous. That night, I sat by the fire and stared into the flames for hours. I remembered my mother's voice, telling me once when I was 16, sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing. That's how you know it's worth doing. Was this worth doing? I didn't know. But I knew one thing. I couldn't make that decision out of fear. If I chose not to go through with it, it couldn't be because I was afraid. I had to find clarity, and I didn't have it yet. I turned off the lights and went to bed. That night, I had a dream. I was young again, maybe 30, and I was standing in a sunlit kitchen holding a baby in my arms. There was laughter in the room, soft music playing, and the smell of cinnamon rolls in the oven. I looked down at the baby. Their face was glowing. And when I looked up, I saw myself in the mirror, smiling in a way I hadn't smiled in years. I woke up crying, not from sadness, from longing. Maybe I couldn't rewrite the years I'd lost. Maybe I couldn't change the past. But maybe, just maybe, I'd been given one more chance to feel that kind of love again. And maybe that was enough. I woke up that morning with a strange calmness in my chest. Not peace exactly, but a quiet in the noise. A stillness. Like something inside me had made a choice, even if I hadn't said it out loud yet. I moved slowly through the kitchen, making oatmeal the same way I always had. A pinch of salt, a bit of brown sugar, and a splash of milk. But everything felt different now. The same way your childhood home feels smaller when you visit it as an adult. The rooms hadn't changed, but you had. I placed my hand over my belly. Still flat, still unremarkable, but I felt it. That flutter, not of movement, but of knowing. A tiny voice inside me whispering, "I'm here." Then the phone rang. I jumped, heart thudding. Nobody calls me early in the morning unless it's important, or bad. I picked up, expecting Katie, but it wasn't. "Mom?" It was Michael, my middle son, the quiet one, the one I hadn't spoken to in over 8 months. "Michael, is everything okay?" There was a long pause. "Katie called me. She told me." My throat tightened. I sat down hard in the chair beside the window, staring out into the snow-covered yard. "She had no right," I said softly. "She was worried, and I think she thought I should know." Another pause. I waited, holding my breath. Then, "Is it true?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yes, it's true. I'm pregnant." There it was, said again, out loud. And still, it didn't feel real. Michael exhaled sharply. I braced myself for anger, for laughter, for shame. But instead, he asked a question I wasn't expecting. "How are you?" I blinked. Tears welled instantly. "I'm scared, Michael." That was all I could say. Not, "I'm fine." Not, "I've got this." Just the truth. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Do you want to talk about it?" And for the first time in what felt like years, I let him in. We talked for nearly 2 hours. I told him about the doctor, the heartbeat, the risks. I told him I was still deciding what to do, that I wasn't sure I could do this alone. And he said something that shattered me. "You're not alone, Mom. I know we've been distant, and I have a lot of regrets about that. But I want to be here. I want to help." I cried. Not the kind of crying that hurts, but the kind that heals. Because sometimes, healing doesn't come in a wave. Sometimes, it comes in a whisper from someone you thought was long gone. Later that week, I drove to my second ultrasound appointment. The roads were icy, and the sky was a heavy gray, like it hadn't decided whether to snow or cry. Inside the clinic, Dr. Collins greeted me with a warm nod. He didn't say much, just helped me onto the table, applied the gel, and turned on the monitor. The screen flickered, and then nothing. No flicker, no heartbeat, just a blur of silence. I looked at his face. He wasn't smiling. He moved the probe again, adjusting, scanning, checking. And again, nothing. He cleared his throat, gently set the device down, and turned off the screen. "Margaret, I'm so sorry." The room spun. The walls felt too close. My breath came short and sharp. "It's gone?" I whispered. He nodded. "It must have happened recently. There's no heartbeat." I felt like I was falling into a hole that had no bottom. Not again. Not this. Not this kind of loss. I left the clinic in a fog. I don't even remember driving home. All I know is that I sat on my porch for hours, not moving. Just empty. Later that night, Katie called. I told her. She cried with me. So did Michael. Even Darren, who finally returned my call. And for the first time in decades, all 3 of my children were speaking to me at the same time. Grief is strange like that. It can build bridges where silence once lived. I had lost the baby, but I had found something else, or maybe someone else. The days after I lost the baby were the quietest days of my life. Not just outside, inside too. There was a kind of hush in my chest, a strange and aching stillness. No more flutter, no more what-ifs. Just silence where hope had lived for a short, fragile while. I didn't cry right away. I think some part of me went numb, like when you lose someone and your body hasn't caught up with the truth yet. I moved through the motions, made tea, fed the birds, folded laundry. But I wasn't really there. My body was, but the rest of me was somewhere else entirely. Adrift. People think grief only shows up when you've lost someone you've known, someone you've held, someone who's looked back into your eyes. But grief doesn't ask for time to grow. It doesn't need long histories. Sometimes it just is, all at once, sudden and suffocating. I had barely begun to understand that baby. I didn't even know their name, their face, their future. But I had loved them, in my own way. In that strange, fierce way only a woman who thought her womb was done can love. Katie came to visit that weekend. First time she'd been up here, in over a year. When I opened the door, she didn't say a word. She just pulled me into her arms and held me for a long time. We stood there like statues, the wind howling outside, my cheek pressed against her shoulder. She stayed for 3 days. We cooked together, cleaned out the baby quilt from the hope chest, and sat in silence when there were no words. She didn't rush me to talk. She didn't fill the space with pity or platitudes. One night, as we sat in front of the fireplace wrapped in blankets, she looked at me and said softly, "Do you regret it?" I thought for a long time before answering. "No," I said. "I don't. I wish it had ended differently. I wish I had met them. But no. I don't regret having loved something that small, that real." She nodded. I could see the tears in her eyes. And in that moment, I knew. This experience hadn't only changed me. It had changed her too. Before she left, she placed a small wooden box on my nightstand. "I made this for you," she said. "It's for keeping things, even if there's nothing to keep." Inside was a single note, handwritten. "You are not broken. You are still becoming." After Katie went back home, Michael called again. Then Darren. For the first time in decades, my children were reaching for me. Not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. Something human. We talked about the past, about the years we lost in silence. I apologized. So did they. There's something about shared grief that softens hard edges. One morning, about 2 weeks later, I woke before dawn. The snow had fallen heavy overnight, blanketing everything in that perfect white silence. I stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in a thick robe, steaming mug in hand. The sky was still dark, but the stars were glowing. I stood there, breathing deep, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, and I said something out loud, just to the wind. "Thank you for coming, even if you couldn't stay." The air was still. Not a breeze, not a whisper. But in my bones, I felt something shift. That was the first time I smiled in days. Not because the pain had passed, but because something else had taken root in me. Not a baby, but a kind of rebirth. Grief doesn't vanish. It settles. It finds corners to live in. Your favorite mug, the creak of the porch swing, the quiet just before you. Fall asleep. It doesn't shout forever, but it doesn't leave either. It learns to hum. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it, soft as a lullaby. I began waking up before the sun again. At primero por insomnia, después por hábito. There was something sacred about those moments before the world stirred. Just me, the sky, and the slow warmth of light stretching across the snow. I'd sit by the window, holding my tea, and whisper little things into the air. Good morning, little one. I miss you. And somehow, those words didn't sting as much as they did before. About a month had passed when I finally ventured back into town. I put on my wool coat, fixed my hair, and walked to the bakery. The Peterson sisters hadn't seen me in weeks, but the moment I stepped inside, they smiled like I'd never left. There's our Maggie, one of them said. We've been keeping your cinnamon rolls warm. That's the thing about small towns. They know when not to ask. They just are, present, gentle, available. I took my usual seat by the window, the one where the sunlight lands directly on your lap around 10 a.m. I watched people pass, their boots crunching over the fresh snow, faces red from the cold. Life hadn't paused just because mine had, and I realized neither could I. Later that week, I returned to the community quilting circle. I hadn't sewn a stitch since the pregnancy. My hands were stiff, my eyes blurry, but I sat down with the fabric anyway. Old muscle memory kicked in. Needle, thread, pull, knot, breathe. The other women didn't ask anything, and I didn't explain. But when I reached into my bag and pulled out the half-finished baby quilt, a few eyes misted. They knew. They felt it, and one of them, Clara, who'd lost her daughter years ago, reached over, placed her hand on mine, and whispered, "Keep sewing, sweetheart. It helps." I did, one square at a time, each stitch a small act of defiance against the silence, a way of saying, I remember. I'm still here. Katie called often, Michael too. Even Darren surprised me, sending a handmade wooden frame in the mail with a photo of the three of them when they were kids, standing in front of the old oak tree in our backyard in Ohio. Inside the box, he'd written, "You did more right than you know." It broke me. But this time, the breaking didn't feel like destruction. It felt like expansion. That weekend, I made something new for the first time since the loss. Not a quilt. Not a journal entry. A nursery. I took the old sewing room and dusted every corner. I opened the windows, let the cold air in. I cleaned the shelves, scrubbed the floors, and placed the little wooden box Katie had given me right in the center of the dresser. Not because I thought I'd need a nursery again, but because I needed the space, the hope, a reminder that even when something ends, not everything does. That same night, I lit a candle and wrote a letter, not to anyone living. Just to them. You didn't stay long, but you stirred everything, my body, my memory, my children, my heart. You brought things to the surface I thought were long gone. You made me feel young again, terrified again, alive again. Thank you for choosing me, even if just for a moment. I folded it, placed it in the little wooden box, and closed the lid. It was time to move forward, not forget. Never that, but move. The first time I laughed, really laughed, after losing the baby, it caught me by surprise. I was sitting on the porch, bundled in my thickest sweater, trying to untangle a mess of Christmas lights that had been in the attic since the year before. My fingers weren't nimble anymore, and my joints ached from the cold. But there I was, tugging, twisting, cursing under my breath. And suddenly, the whole mess fell apart in my lap, blinking red and green like a tiny electric miracle. And I laughed. Not because of the lights, but because I realized I had been holding my breath for weeks, maybe months. And in that moment, something cracked open, like light pouring through a door. I forgot was even there. Life had returned. Not in the way I expected, not with diapers and bottles, but in laughter, in breath, in the absurdity of tangled wires and blinking bulbs. Sometimes it doesn't take much. The holidays came quietly that year. Katie flew in again, and this time she brought her daughter, Isabel, my only granddaughter. She was 8, bright-eyed and curious about everything. She looked just like Katie did at that age, down to the gap between her front teeth and the stubborn cowlick in her hair. One evening, while Katie napped on the couch, Isabel sat with me at the kitchen table while I worked on what had become the final stitches of the baby quilt. She watched me for a while, then asked softly, "Grandma, who's the quilt for?" I paused. My throat tightened, but not with sadness, with love. It was for someone special, someone I didn't get to meet. She thought for a second, then nodded. "Can I help you finish it?" She picked up a scrap of fabric and clumsily pushed the needle through. Crooked, messy, perfect. And in that moment, I understood. Some things do stay. Love stays. That tiny spark I carried in me, it hadn't vanished. It had multiplied. Through Isabel's hands. Through the way my children had come back into my life. Through every person who'd held me in my grief without trying to fix it. One night, a few weeks later, I stood in front of the mirror again. Same white hair, same lines around my mouth. But my eyes, they weren't the same. There was fire, again. Not wild, not loud, just steady. I took down the baby box from the dresser and opened it. Inside were the letter, a lock of my hair I'd cut when the pregnancy began, and the finished quilt, folded neatly, a little crooked from Isabel's help. I decided then what to do with it. The next day, I drove to the small women's shelter 2 towns over. A quiet place run by kind women, where mothers and babies came when they had nowhere else to go. I walked in, holding the box in my arms. The woman at the front desk, her name was Janine, smiled when I handed it to her. "This is for someone who needs it," I said. She opened the box and gasped softly. "Did you make this?" I nodded. "A long story lives inside those stitches." She touched the fabric gently, like she could feel the story stitched into every thread. "Thank you," she whispered. I walked out lighter than I'd felt in years. And that's when I realized I had become someone new, not because I gave birth, not because I lost, but because I loved anyway. And now, that love lived in a quilt, in a story, in a future that wasn't mine, but could still be touched by me. It's funny, the things we believe about ourselves, that we've passed the point of no return, that certain doors are closed forever, that some stories are too old to be rewritten. But now looking back, I know that's not true, because I lived it. I, Margaret Louise Parker, 77 years old, thought my life was finished being surprising. I thought the only thing ahead of me was the slow winding down of time. Soft mornings, quiet evenings, old memories, faded photographs. And then, out of nowhere, came a new heartbeat, a spark, a second wind I never asked for and didn't know I needed. That little life inside me, however brief, wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a gift, not because it ended the way I wanted, but because it woke me up. Before that pregnancy, I hadn't laughed in months. I hadn't cried in years. I hadn't let myself be vulnerable in decades. But the moment I heard, "You're pregnant," something ancient and sacred opened up inside me. It cracked me open. And yes, I grieved. I grieved deeply. I sat in that loss like a storm, soaking, wet, and unable to move. I let it break me. And in doing that, I made space for something I'd forgotten was even possible. Transformation. People often think transformation happens quickly, like a decision, a switch flipped, a dramatic moment. But sometimes, transformation is slow. It's a whisper in the dark, a cup of tea held with shaking hands, a stitch sewn with trembling fingers, a quiet, "I forgive you," spoken after years of silence. A smile returned. A door reopened. It's loss that doesn't destroy, but rebuilds. It's grief that doesn't harden, but softens. And sometimes it comes in the shape of something you never expected to hold again. That baby, though I never saw their face or felt their tiny hands in mine, repaired things in my life I didn't even realize were broken. I speak to them sometimes. Not in words, but in gestures. When I visit the shelter and donate blankets. When I sit with a grieving woman who's just lost something precious. When I hold Isabel a little tighter before she runs off to play. When I smile at the mirror and say, "I'm still here." This isn't a story about a miracle pregnancy. It's a story about remembrance, about finding yourself again in the aftermath of something unbelievable. It's about how we're never too old to begin again. Never too far gone to feel joy. Never too late to love. If you're listening to this, and you've ever felt forgotten, or useless, or finished, hear me now. You're not done. Your story is still being written, and sometimes the most beautiful chapters come after the ones you thought would be your last. Thank you for letting me share mine with you, with all my heart, Margaret.